So, let's begin to address now the question which is before us in this particular session, session 5, in our class of Christian apologetics. Both experiment and observation has seemed to demonstrate that the God of Scripture does not exist. Numerous problems, such as the constant speed of light, seem to show that the universe must be much older than Scripture predicts. But are such arguments really valid? Well, in this session, we're going to be exploring and really arguing the point that the one-way speed of light is ultimately not a science question, and that therefore the argument cannot be reasonably foisted against the Scriptures. So we're going to be essentially answering this question: if light takes billions of years to get here, doesn't that mean that the universe is billions of years old? Well, on April the 4th of 1931, the prestigious journal Nature cited the following question, quote, "If the velocity of light is constant, that is, it never changes, how is it that new determinations invariably give values which are lower than the last one obtained?" End quote. Well, the somewhat troubling statement was drawn from the work of noted French astronomer M.E.J. Curie-Debray. He was said to have based his conclusions on nearly 75 years of observational research into the speed of light. Several years after Debray published his results, astronomer Frank Edmondson of the University of Indiana suggested that Debray's observations could perhaps be best explained by adopting certain assumptions regarding the expansion of our universe. Listen to what he said, quote, "M.E.J. Curie-Debray has directed attention to an apparent decrease in the velocity of light. I have recently tried to explain this on the basis of the theory of the expanding universe." Edmondson then went on to comment on Debray's work, admitting to the startling clarity of his research, conceding, quote, "I determined that Debray's data represented the observations in a satisfactory manner," end quote. Well, Debray's work was initially professionally tolerated. The idea that the speed of light is gradually slowing was big news. He therefore published his findings for a total of 3 times, with 2 of his reports featured in the most respected journal of his day. Later reviews of his work gradually changed as the astrophysical community came to repudiate the concept that light is slowing down. At present, no discussion is being entertained on the subject of the gradual slowing of light's speed. Well, the topic of light speed is, of course, important for many, many Christians today. Some have considered this as an obstacle to faith. Through examining the book of Genesis, these believers have insisted that the current rates threaten the Bible's recent universe claims. That is, the idea that the universe is very young. Others have concluded that such concerns are really unfounded, since Genesis may be reread to accommodate for a greater age. Couldn't we just simply reread Genesis chapter 1 to suggest to us that the universe is billions of years old? What would be the problem with that? However, most skeptics seem to treat this kind of an option with contempt, as a sort of shameful ploy to rescue the Bible's case. And so it is commonly accused that this would be an example of concordism on the grandest possible scales. The question is, do the current measurements threaten the Scriptures? The idea that the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. Must Christians truly resort to rehashing Debray's old claims? Or should believers rather search the book of Genesis in order to harmonize the speed of light with faith? Perhaps so that the universe ends up being billions of years old, biblically speaking. Well, some gospel defenders, such as Barry Setterfield, have contended that Debray's work is really the key to settling the case, that the idea that the speed of light has gradually slowed throughout time would be the reason that we think that light years are far shorter than they would need to be to make 6,000 years possible. But do we need, and this is the question, do we need to suppose that current light speed theory has anything to say at all about matters of science and faith? Well, recently, I confronted this question while delivering a lecture. I was speaking on the subject of our current theories of cosmic beginnings, and my class had begun discussing the numerous proofs of God's existence and had now begun to explore the most common scientific counterclaims. Among the various options, we had examined the belief that the Big Bang has somehow replaced the God of faith. And it was then that a student responded with a vitally important question which challenged the deeper purpose behind our broader gospel case. He started by saying to me, the problem that you have proposed here, Mr. Fisher, has presented a number of challenging issues. A supernatural cosmic origin must replace the Big Bang. But tell me, how does this prove the God of the Bible? Perhaps the God of creation is more generic than the one that you have presented. In that case, he queried, why continue pressing the issue here? Why bother insisting that the Big Bang never happened? Doesn't science, for other reasons, still disprove the God of Scripture? Maybe we ought, therefore, to abandon these sort of science and faith debates. And I think that a lot of us have encountered that kind of reasoning. Hey, just forget about the whole discussion. It's pointless anyway. As soon as you knock one proof down from science, there are 100 others to knock down after that. Well, as I paused to consider the proposition, the facts were indeed hard to resist. Science seems to challenge a number of Scripture's key claims. The book of Genesis, for instance, has been the cause of much discussions, with the time scale of creation forming the very heart of the debate. And yet in the months prior to my current presentation, I had slowly begun to wonder why these issues continue to rage. In fact, given my most recent readings, it appeared that modern science lacked an objective grounding for establishing its critical case. And so, seeing so, I began to recount my latest research, namely my study into the rapid speed of light. Here, modern science has long contended that light years are far shorter than the Scriptures would have us predict. Thus, even the smallest distances are simply too vast for the speed of light to somehow travel or shortly traverse. Accordingly, modern skeptics argue that Moses must have been mistaken about the timing of creation, as well as the God he claimed existed. Well, the speed of light, of course, certainly does evoke a lot of perplexing questions for us today. Christians often view it as one of the most difficult doubts to resist. Hey, if speed of light dictates that the universe must be billions of years old, then why even resist the question to begin with? But the challenge of distant starlight surprisingly arouses more questions about the limits of science than about the God of Holy Scripture. Fundamental problems about the speed of light, in fact, continue to energize science circles today. And most remarkably, none of the most puzzling questions have anything to do with de Bray's radical claims that the speed of light is gradually slowing. And so therefore I sought to discuss really the biggest problem for modern science concerning this issue, the age-old challenge of measuring the one-way speed of light. You have to listen very carefully to this point. Essentially, the issue here stretches back to the days of Aristotle, who attempted to settle the question through crude lamp and shutter experiments. Later investigation revived in the 19th century, just a few scant years prior to Einstein's seminal work. And the world of modern physics has ever since remained gridlocked on the question of how to measure the speed of light in one-way transit. One-way transit. Now, unfortunately, typical laymen often seem to miss the point here. Many fail to see that this is different from what de Bray was claiming, the idea that the speed of light is slowing down. In fact, conflicting questions about the one-way speed of light have nothing to do with the idea that the speed of light is therefore changing. The situation is rather that the entire phenomenon lies beyond the purview of science with no hope of remediation. In simple terms, the one-way speed of light cannot be humanly observed. And this leaves us with no ability to test the matter under question. Now, to illustrate the problem, just consider the following example. Many of my students seemed to appreciate this experiment. Imagine that you are standing on a basketball court located somewhere in Lower East Manhattan, which would have been my old stomping grounds. As you busily dribble the ball, your mind is aware of the length of time it takes for the ball to hit the pavement. Using both your senses of sight and sound, you clock your dribble internally, creating an ease of play and motion. So everyone got the picture here? You dribbling a basketball. Now imagine that your powers of seeing and hearing are suddenly removed. How in such a case could you measure the ball's motion? Well, with no ability to properly use your senses, you would quickly become unable to track the ball's rebounding movements. And this would make it impossible to measure the time it takes for the ball to leave your hand and hit the pavement beneath you. In fact, the only way to know that the ball has hit the floor is if it actually returned to the hand you used to set it into motion, correct? If you can't see, if you can't hear, the only way to know that the ball hit the ground is if it slapped your hand, correct? Now, this is precisely the problem with measuring one-way light speed. Human beings can only see light in two-way transit. In other words, the only way to know that a beam of light has hit a distant object or a reflective object is if the light has returned to the observer using the lamp that sourced its motion. You understand that? So if you turn on a light and it hits a mirror, the reason that you know it hit the mirror is because the light has reflected back to your eye. Astrophysicists therefore cannot measure one-way light speeds any more than Helen Keller could play defense for the New York Knicks. The question simply lies... Okay, so the question simply lies beyond our empirical borders. In other words, properly speaking, this is not a science question, people. And so, for this reason, I began to challenge my students accordingly. I spoke to them of the problem so often found in these sorts of protestings. Because skeptics who claim that science disproves the God of Scripture often don't pause to examine the basis for their own objections. Speed of light theory, in fact, has proven fairly convincingly that light in one-way motion may actually be clocked to suit our preferences. What do you want it to be today? The point is, astrophysics will never settle this question. The speed of light, therefore, cannot be used against the Scriptures. Examining my students' faces, however, I could see that some of them were not convinced. A few seemed to be fooled by their own counterintuitions. For if we know the two-way speed of light, then what is to prevent us from taking that measured value and simply dividing it by 2? Can't you just do that? But such solutions are frankly viewed by most modern scientists today as ignorant of the challenges which the problem here presents. In fact, this sort of answer has failed to sway the current guild of researchers, and the issue has now been at last finally settled. About this, Albert Einstein eventually conceded defeat. Following his years of study, he capitulated to the point completely. Through pondering the implications of his groundbreaking research in the area of special relativity, he admitted that one-way light speed is not subject to human observation. Quote, "The amount of time light requires to travel from A to B is in reality not a hypothesis about the physical nature of light, but a stipulation which I make of my own free will in order to arrive at a definition of simultaneity." In other words, you just simply pick how fast you want it to go, so long as the two-way trip remains this. Well, Albert Einstein's words deliver to us a powerful point. There is no physical consequence to adjusting light in one-way transit. So long as the speed of the two-way trip remains essentially unaffected, the observer may choose from an infinite number of conventional speeds and measurements. In other words, what do you want the differential to be today? Just go ahead and pick it. You'll be right. That's essentially what they're saying here. Thus, the speed of the ball's vertical drop is entirely irrelevant if the pitch and bound of the ball remains consistent to my original observations. Thus, there is no physical basis for saying that light takes all of billions of years to reach our planet's surface. Now, of course, none of this, folks, none of this is to say that Einstein's work is, or Einstein's opinion here is fully accepted. At times, many scientists will claim to have cracked the 100-year mystery. I mean, we've been studying this for about a century. Thus, philosopher of science Alan Janus comments, quote, "Editors of respected scientific journals continue to accept, from time to time, papers purporting to measure one-way light speed. He then went on to dryly state, quote, an application of the procedure I described shows where the errors lie. Now, incidentally, the examples that I have spouted off in this session are really wholly parallel to Alan Janus's basic contentions. And so I therefore close my argument by summarizing my point. Changing one-way light speeds yields no physical consequences. But this also means that evenly dividing the two-way trip ultimately produces no physical consequences either. Thus, skeptics cannot use two-way light speeds to demonstrate that Genesis was wrong or that the God of Scripture does not exist. In fact, this claim is a profound abuse of science on a subject where, properly speaking, human imaginations should refrain from interfering.